Hi, it's Saturday afternoon and it's not a very nice day today. It's horribly windy with an east wind, and I suppose this is the first signs of autumn. So I'm going to do a short walk, very short walk. I'm standing at Carfax, the centre of Oxford. Up there is Cornmarket Street, the pedestrian precinct, and that's roughly north. That is roughly east and goes down to the plain Headington Carfax. The plain Headington, Cowley and Iffley. And I'm going to go down St Aldates, southish. I'm just starting here to help people who may not quite know where the place I'm going is. And I'm going to go to the Alice shop and talk about Alice Through the Looking Glass and its connection with the shop and the real Alice's connection with the shop. So this is St Aldates. It's very busy like the rest of central Oxford because it's Saturday. But it'll probably thin out a bit once I get past the bus stops. That's the town hall opposite, and it's useful to know that it's got a cafe. It's got the little Museum of Oxford, and it has good quality public toilets, which are considerably cleaner than the rest of the toilets in Oxford. That's Tom Tower, part of Christchurch, in the distance. That's the main post office. That's the Old Tom, which is a nice place to drink. Christchurch on the left, on the other side of the road. G&D's Ice Cream Cafe, one of 3 branches here. This is a purely local business. St Aldates Church. Pembroke College. It's a nice setting and rather more human in scale than Christchurch is. That's Christchurch. That connects with St Ebbs. There are shops up the next street. Those are the Memorial Gardens, built round about 1920, and they have a slight connection to the Alice shop that I'm coming to.
Excellent service, you know.
That's an elegant little ground floor. Right, so this is where I'm heading today.
This is for TikTok, yeah?
Now, if you've read the Alice books, you'll recognise a lot of the objects pictured here. There's Alice herself, there's the White Rabbit with his pocket watch, there's the Cheshire Cat, although they've drawn the cat as well as the grin, I notice. There's, I guess that's Tweedledum or Tweedledee. There's the Red Queen. And there are quite a few others. There's Alice playing croquet with a flamingo as croquet mallet. Okay, well, before I talk about the shop, let me just talk about Alice for anybody that doesn't know. Lewis Carroll was the author, and his real name was Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. Lewis Carroll was a pen name, but I'm going to keep calling him Lewis Carroll because it's easier. He was a maths tutor, and he taught at Christchurch, which I've just pointed out. And there was a real Alice, an Alice Liddell, who was the daughter of the dean. The dean is the head of the governing body, so the overall head of the college. In other colleges, they might be called master or principal or warden. Names vary between colleges. Oxford academics are popularly called dons, so you can think of the dean of Christchurch as top don. So Alice Liddell was one of his daughters, and he had two other daughters, Lorina and Edith. So that's Alice. There was a real Alice. And Lewis Carroll became a family friend of the Liddells and went on outings with them and arranged his own outings with the daughters. And there is one famous outing called the Golden Afternoon, which took place on the 4th of July 1862. That date, the 4th of July, I'm pretty sure that's why Oxford holds Alice Day round about then. I did an Alice Day video on, maybe it was a Saturday the 6th, but it was probably the nearest weekend to the 4th of July anyway. Anyway, on that golden afternoon, 4th of July 1862, Lewis Carroll took Alice, Lorina and Edith on a boating trip. And during the trip, he improvised the story that eventually became Alice in Wonderland. Alice Liddell eventually asked Lewis Carroll to write the story down, and he gave her the first manuscript. Of course, in those days, this would have been handwritten rather than Xeroxed or duplicated in any other way. I don't think they even had typewriters then. And that first version of the manuscript was called Alice's Adventures Underground. This was the original of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And if it starts in the same way as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, then it begins with Alice seeing a white rabbit, hurrying, looking at his watch and saying something like, "Oh, my tails and whiskers, I'll be late." And I think he disappears down a hole in the ground, and Alice follows him. And she has wonderful potions and things to eat that say, "Eat me and drink me." And it all goes on from there. And obviously the original title, Alice's Adventures Underground, is because of her going down that hole. The final version, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, was published in 1865, and it was followed in 1871 or 1872, depending on what I read, by Alice Through the Looking Glass. And it's Alice Through the Looking Glass that the shop is most concerned with, so that's what I'm going to talk about. And in Alice Through the Looking Glass, one chapter is set in a dark little shop. Two illustrations clearly show that it's this shop. Long, narrow and crowded. And this was Alice's nearest sweet shop, apparently. So it's not surprising that Lewis Carroll should use it in his story. And in the story, which I'm going to read in a minute, Alice meets the shopkeeper and some objects that behave in a very odd way. And for part of the time, the shopkeeper is an old sheep. And that's why it says here, Lewis Carroll's old sheep shop through the looking glass. Well, according to the shop's website, the shop continued as a local sweet shop and newsagent for over 100 years, and it's always had an Alice's shop sign up, not so much for tourism in the early days, but just for people who'd come across it in the book and wanted to know where the original was. And one of the other descriptions of it says that from the 1960s onward it slowly became more Alice-fied, and today it's not a newsagent or a sweet shop at all. It's entirely devoted to Alice memorabilia. Like that. As the shop's website also says, it has fully embraced its heritage. Now is the Alice in Wonderland shop in every respect. So I'm going to read chapter 5 and a little bit of the surrounding text from Alice Through the Looking Glass. But the road is very noisy, and I've just thought that it's probably better if I get off the road. And where better to go than some land owned by Christchurch. So I'm going to go through the memorial gardens, which were built in 1920 or just after. And the connection there with the shop is that it seems the shop was going to be, it seems there were plans to demolish the shop when these gardens were built. The gardens are on the other side, but all the buildings on this side were demolished. And maybe it just seemed time for a spring clean of the other side as well. And Dr. Gunther noticed these plans, saw these plans, and wrote and made the fact more public, complained, I think, to the Times. In those days, writing a letter to the Times was quite an effective form of complaint. They didn't have Facebook and Instagram and so on. And the shop was saved. So now I'm going through the memorial gardens. There is the shop partially obscured by a tree. I'm going through the memorial gardens and to Christchurch Meadow. Oh, those are nice and wild. All I can say is lucky Alice Liddell. She would have had gorgeous surroundings like this and probably the best food on the planet for just about every day that her dad continued to be at Christchurch. And when you're Dean, I don't think you ever have to wait to be served, and I bet he got plenty of port as well. They probably made sure that they served him first before all the other dons. After all, he was top don. So that's the back of one of the Christchurch buildings. Oh, that's useful to know. I've told you about Horsebox coffee, but I didn't know there was a cafe here, so that's worth knowing. So that's Longhorn Coffee.
Sorry?
Longhorn Coffee.
Yes, I know it's kind of connected with the shop somehow, but I can't say it. So
Right. Okay, thanks.
no worries. Yeah.
As you can see, this is quite a popular tourist spot too. If you go down there and straight on, you pass the boathouses, you get onto what's called Boathouse Island. And then at the end, you come to a branch of the river. And if you were able to get across it, you'd end up in Aston's Eyot, the nature reserve off Iffley Road. Sadly, apart from a few days when they needed a pontoon bridge to transport some equipment, that land has been cut off. You can't get down there, so you have to go the long way round. If you go to the left, you can walk around the meadow and you eventually come along Dead Man's Walk to the north of Merton Field, which I followed when I videoed the filming what I think was young Sherlock. Anyway, that's Christchurch Meadow, and it's a lot quieter than St Aldates, so I'm going to stand by a tree and read the Alice excerpt. Okay, so I'm now at the end of the chapter before the old sheep shop, and Alice is talking to the Queen. She is just called the Queen in the text. There are two queens in the story, the red and white, corresponding to the two queens of a chess game. And I think this is the white queen, but I'm not quite sure. The Queen has just pricked herself on the brooch that does up her shawl, and she's a little bit unhappy about that. And Alice and the Queen are both feeling rather melancholy and trying to console each other. So the Queen says, "Oh, don't go on like that." She wrings her hands. She tries to tell Alice to cheer up. Consider what the time is. Consider anything, only don't cry. And Alice says to the Queen, "Can you keep from crying by considering things?" And the Queen says, "That's the way it's done. Nobody can do two things at once, you know." And they talk about their ages. And then the Queen says, "Now I'll give you something to believe. I'm just 101, 5 months and a day." "I can't believe that," said Alice. "Can't you?" the Queen said in a pitying tone. "Try again. Draw a long breath and shut your eyes." Alice laughed. "There's no use trying," she said. "One can't believe impossible things." And the Queen replies, "I dare say you haven't said..." And the Queen replies, "I dare say you haven't had much practice. When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why? Sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." And then her shawl comes undone again, and she almost loses the brooch that pinned it together. I just mentioned the end of the story because it helps with continuity. The bit about believing 6 impossible things before breakfast is a very widely used quote, so it's worth knowing where it comes from. Little bit about the background, the geography. The world that Alice has fallen into when she goes through the looking glass is like a chessboard. It's divided into squares, and there are little brooks that separate the squares, and each chapter starts or ends with Alice crossing a brook, and she's about to cross a brook now. And here starts the sheep shop stuff. "Oh, much better," cried the Queen, her voice rising into a squeak as she went on. "Much better, much better, better, bear, bear." The last word ended in a long bleat, so like a sheep that Alice quite started. She looked at the Queen, who seemed to have suddenly wrapped herself up in wool. Alice rubbed her eyes and looked again. She couldn't make out what had happened at all. Was she in a shop? And was it really a sheep that was sitting on the other side of the counter? Rub as she would, she could make nothing more of it. She was in a little dark shop, leaning with her elbows on the counter, and opposite to her was an old sheep, sitting in an armchair, knitting, and every now and then leaving off to look at her through a great pair of spectacles. "What is it you want to buy?" the sheep said at last, looking up for a moment from her knitting. "I don't quite know yet," Alice said very gently. "I should like to look all round me first, if I might." "You may look in front of you and on both sides, if you like," said the sheep. "But you can't look all round you unless you've got eyes at the back of your head." But these, as it happened, Alice had not got, so she contented herself with turning round, looking at the shelves as she came to them. The shop seemed to be full of all manner of curious things, but the oddest part of it all was that whenever she looked hard at any shelf to make out exactly what it had on it, that particular shelf was always quite empty, though the others around it were crowded as full as they could hold. "Things flow about so here," she said at last in a plaintive tone, after she had spent a minute or so in vainly pursuing a large bright thing that looked sometimes like a doll and sometimes like a workbox, and was always in the shelf next above the one she was looking at. "And this one is the most provoking of all. But I'll tell you what," she added, as a sudden thought struck her. "I'll follow it up to the very top shelf of all. It'll puzzle it to go through the ceiling, I expect." But even this plan failed. The thing went through the ceiling as quietly as possible, as if it were quite used to it. "Are you a child or a teetotum?" the sheep said as she took up another pair of needles. "You'll make me giddy soon if you go on turning round like that." She was now working with 14 pairs of needles at once, and Alice couldn't help looking at her in great astonishment. How can she knit with so many needles, the puzzled child thought to herself. She gets more and more like a porcupine every minute. "Can you row?" the sheep asked, handing her a pair of knitting needles as she spoke. "Yes, a little, but not on land, and not with needles," Alice was beginning to say, when suddenly the needles turned into oars in her hands, and she found they were in a little boat, gliding along between banks. So there was nothing for it but to do her best. "Feather!" cried the sheep as she took up another pair of needles. This didn't sound like a remark that needed any answer, so Alice said nothing but pulled away. There was something very queer about the water, she thought, as every now and then the oars got stuck fast in it, and would hardly come out again. "Feather! Feather!" the sheep cried again, taking more needles. "You'll be catching a crab directly." "A dear little crab," thought Alice. "I should like that." "Didn't you hear me say feather?" the sheep cried angrily, taking up quite a bunch of needles. "Indeed I did," said Alice. "You've said it very often and very loud. Please, where are the crabs?" "In the water, of course," said the sheep, sticking some of the needles into her hair as her hands were full. "Feather, I say." "Why do you say feather so often?" Alice asked at last, rather vexed. "I'm not a bird." "You are," said the sheep. "You're a little goose." This offended Alice a little, so there was no more conversation for a minute or two, while the boat glided gently on, sometimes among beds of weeds, which made the oars stick fast in the water worse than ever, and sometimes under trees, but always with the same tall river banks frowning over their heads. "Oh, please, there are some scented rushes," Alice cried in a sudden transport of delight. "There really are, and such beauties." "You needn't say please to me about 'em," the sheep said without looking up from her knitting. "I didn't put 'em there, and I'm not going to take 'em away." "No, but I meant, please, may we wait and pick some?" Alice pleaded. "If you don't mind stopping the boat for a minute." "How am I to stop it?" said the sheep. "If you leave off rowing, it'll stop by itself." So the boat was left to drift down the stream as it would, till it glided gently in among the waving rushes. And then the little sleeves were carefully rolled up, and the little arms were plunged in elbow deep, to get hold of the rushes a good long way down before breaking them off. And for a while Alice forgot all about the sheep and the knitting, as she bent over the side of the boat, with just the ends of her tangled hair dipping into the water, while with bright, eager eyes she caught at one bunch after another of the darling scented rushes. "I only hope the boat won't tipple over," she said to herself. "Oh, what a lovely one! Only I couldn't quite reach it." And it certainly did seem a little provoking, almost as if it happened on purpose, she thought, that though she managed to pick plenty of beautiful rushes as the boat glided by, there was always a more lovely one that she couldn't reach. "The prettiest are always further," she said at last, with a sigh at the obstinacy of the rushes in growing so far off, as, with flushed cheeks and dripping hair and hands, she scrambled back into her place and began to arrange her newfound treasures. What mattered to her just then that the rushes had begun to fade and to lose all their scent and beauty from the very moment that she picked them? Even real scented rushes, you know, last only a very little while, and these, being dream rushes, melted away almost like snow as they lay in heaps at her feet. But Alice hardly noticed this. There were so many other curious things to think about. They hadn't gone much further before the blade of one of the oars got fast in the water and wouldn't come out again. So Alice explained it afterwards. And the consequence was that the handle of it caught her under the chin, and in spite of a series of little shrieks of "Oh, oh, oh!" from poor Alice, it swept her straight off the seat in the boat and down among the heap of rushes. However, she wasn't a bit hurt, and was soon up again. The sheep went on with her knitting all the while, just as if nothing had happened. "That was a nice crab you caught," she remarked, as Alice got back into her place, very much relieved to find herself still in the boat. "Was it? I didn't see it," said Alice, peeping cautiously over the side of the boat into the dark water. "I wish it hadn't let go. I should like a little crab to take home with me." But the sheep only laughed scornfully and went on with her knitting. "Are there many crabs here?" said Alice. "Crabs and all sorts of things," said the sheep. "Plenty of choice. Only make up your mind." "Now, what do you want to buy?" "To buy?" Alice echoed in a tone that was half astonished and half frightened. For the oars and the boat and the river had vanished all in a moment, and she was back again in the little dark shop. "I should like to buy an egg, please," she said timidly. "How do you sell them?" "5 farthing for one, 2 for 2, the sheep replied. "Then 2 are cheaper than 1, Alice said in a surprised tone, taking out her purse. "Only you must eat them both if you buy 2, said the sheep. "Then I'll have 1, please," said Alice as she put the money down on the counter. For she thought to herself, they mightn't be at all nice, you know. The sheep took the money and put it away in a box. Then she said, "I never put things into people's hands. That would never do. You must get it for yourself." And so saying, she went off to the other end of the shop and set the egg upright on a shelf. "I wonder why it wouldn't do," thought Alice, as she groped her way among the tables and chairs, for the shop was very dark towards the end. "The egg seems to get further away the more I walk towards it. Let me see, is this a chair? Why, it's got branches, I declare. How very odd to find trees growing here. And actually here's a little brook. Well, this is the very queerest shop I ever saw." So she went on, wondering more and more at every step, as everything turned into a tree the moment she came up to it, and she quite expected the egg to do the same. And that's the end of chapter 5. The egg gets larger and larger as she comes up to it, and it turns into Humpty Dumpty. So that's the story of the shop in the published Alice Through the Looking Glass. The text, by the way, is from a book by Martin Gardner, who for a long time was a maths populariser with Scientific American, and he wrote The Annotated Alice as a way of, he loved the 2 stories himself, and he wrote The Annotated Alice as a way of explaining them to others, because there are all sorts of terms now that are archaic, that wouldn't be understood, or that involve specialised knowledge and wouldn't be understood because of that. Catching a crab is one. As far as I know, that refers to something going wrong when you row. You haven't put the oars in the water properly, so they don't grip, but I'm not sure exactly what it means, and neither will be a lot of other people. So he explains things like that, and the book is very much worth reading. Well, here I am, Christchurch Meadow, and I've been talking about Alice's shop and reading the original text that involved it. I'll see you next time.